thing I'd like to mention when we get into sort of the application of teaching planes is that I really urge you that in combination with this particular session I'm doing now, that you go and read this this blog that I've written called Teaching Planes in PE Theory Lesson, my 10 top tips. Hard to say that. And this is a much more comprehensive, thorough kind of consideration. It goes through a huge volume of ideas that you can use, many actual learning ideas, like actual question answer ideas that you've got in here, how to look at supporting them around exam questions, etc., etc. So that is a blog that I really insist that you go and get sort of stuck in with, I suppose, that you could consider. But with that in mind, let's get to some of the sort of fundamentals of what we need to do. And what I want to set up here is the idea of this is meant to be different. The idea here of, let me get a better colour, the idea here of minimum requirements. When we teach planes, what should we be sort of setting ourselves as standards as PE teachers to say, look, this is roughly how we need to go about doing this. So first of all, these are my opinion of the minimum requirements. First, I would argue that students must experience movement. Okay, so I realise I'm saying here that you need to have a sports hall or a gym or equivalent available to you, but I am arguing that movement needs to be experienced to truly understand planes. If it's not, then there's going to be limitations here, I'm afraid. The other thing is that the examples you use, the examples must have moving parts. So there's been a bit of a theme, and I feel a bit bad for people who have enjoyed doing this, but there's been a bit of a theme of using like jelly babies or sweets to teach this. I am telling you with certainty, you cannot teach the intuition of planes with jelly babies. Why? Because they have no articulations to them whatsoever. They cannot move. Therefore, they are fundamentally flawed. They can use them as maybe a little fun intro, something like that, but they will not teach the principle of planes, unfortunately. So just want to mention that. And the other thing is there must be emphasis on the word along, and obviously I stressed this when I looked at the sort of the more thorough lesson on planes 7. There must be emphasis on that word. That's what we're trying to get to. What we mustn't do, so this is the kind of what not to do, this is what we want to avoid, folks, okay, so in the teaching. Don't over focus on names. It doesn't matter in the first lesson too much whether you even name this as the sagittal plane. It's not important. They will grasp that once they start quizzing and using this stuff, okay? So that will come. Focus on the intuition, in my opinion. Do not use non-articulating examples. In other words, don't use your jelly babies as examples because they don't have joints. So you must use articulating examples. By the way, sort of art dolls are quite good if you want to use an alternative. I use them all the time. The other thing not to do is teach via slides, and this is the key word, instead of movement. Okay, now there's nothing wrong with using slides in a planes lesson, that's absolutely fine, but they mustn't replace the experience of actually moving along a plane. We can't teach this just on a slide. It will not get the intuition across to students. And the other thing is, don't use teaching time to drill names. I've already mentioned this. Don't use your lesson time to get fixated on the names of the actual planes. That is not good use of teaching time. That will come with experience and intuition. It's actually the easy bit in many ways. Now, with that in mind, I want to give you a couple of examples of what you could do. This activity here I refer to as put baby in the corner. Now, obviously, that's a reference to a film that, of course, I've never seen and I know nothing about, even though I live in a house with 3 females who are obsessed with it. Those 3 females are my partner and my 2 daughters, by the way. Let me stress that. But put baby in the corner. One of the things you can do here is that you can literally label your room. All right, so in some corner of your classroom, could indeed be the sports hall or the gym, that's absolutely fine as well. You're going to label, and of course here your labels are frontal, sagittal and transverse down the bottom here. And what you're going to do is you're going to take one student and you're going to place them in that space. And what you're then going to do is you're going to give instructions to that student. So let me give you an example of what the instructions would be. For example, to get this, you might say to them, flex and I'll say here, your left elbow. So you can imagine, I'm having a nightmare here. You can imagine, for example, that what's going to happen, this is the left elbow here, look. You can imagine now that the arm will come into the elbow, will come into that position there. Clearly that is moving along this particular plane, and you can even say to them, get them doing it, touching the wall. You don't necessarily want them pulling paint or wallpaper off the wall, but literally feeling the skin moving across the wall is a nice way to get sort of intuition of this. Another example could be abduct the right shoulder. Okay, so now you can imagine a situation where, okay, here's the right shoulder here, and they abduct it to here, to here, to here, to here, to here. That's clearly movement along that frontal plane. Now, the other one you might want to get them, transverse is a kind of a trickier one to do, but as an example here, you could ask them to rotate. Let's go for the right arm in the shoulder. Okay, so what the student would do here, is they would literally, here's the right shoulder again. There's the arm. They're literally going to rotate this in that direction, and then in this direction. Another way to do the same thing is the one I commonly do is say to the student, right, you need to rotate to face the other direction. Let's say they're going to rotate in this way. But the rule is they cannot take any part of their foot off the floor. It's actually impossible to do. They will actually end up moving their heel or their toes off the floor to some degree. But you can get them to do that almost like shuffling around in that sort of change of direction kind of style. That's a really nice one for you to think about. Another series of examples that you could use, I would strongly recommend some kind of practical, and let's imagine you're in a sports hall. Obviously choose the environment to suit your school. It could even be a matter of moving the desks out of the way in your classroom if that's all you've got available. And then you want to present a series of challenges to your students. Again, this is detailed more thoroughly in the blog, but this is an example. So challenge 1, you might ask them to perform a cartwheel. And obviously you're going to need to set this up as a safe gymnastics lesson. You guys know how to do that, so I'm not going to teach grandma's eggs here. But they have to do it along and let's say a badminton line, or you could put some markers down. But the key thing is that they have got a set line they have to move along. You could even put markers down so that effectively they've got hand, and then it tends to get a little bit tighter, foot. Okay, so you could actually mark for them where they need to place their hand, and therefore you show them that movement, in this case along that frontal plane. Challenge 2, let's do a second one. Challenge 2, so that's our frontal plane movement along there. It could be, you could ask them to perform a standing pike jump. Okay, and you could maybe do some video work with this and see who can do the best standing pike jump, showing that clear example of flexion at the hip and also at the shoulder, and of course that being movement along the sagittal plane. Obviously you can make like a little worksheet to do this if you want to. And then challenge 3, okay, so the third challenge you can think about here is you want to give the group the opportunity to perform a maximum rotation. Now obviously think about keeping this safe, apply your health and safety principles, but effectively what you're saying here is you're setting them a challenge. Right, if you're stood here, who can rotate the furthest in a single jump? Some students will get 360, you might even get some students getting to sort of 450 degrees, and you might even get a few going a little bit further, but it's actually really difficult. Lots of students will get to 180 degrees, but you can basically sort of give them a challenge of can they move along that transverse axis as far as they can in a single jump, for example. Other ways you can do it is you can also use this in terms of slalom poles. You can set some kind of slalom poles up and have them move in, imagine you've got slalom poles here, 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 and here, and the student has to weave in and out of those slalom poles. Okay, that sort of idea would be really, really nice to get that intuition. And then finally, guys, once you've done that as your kind of practical, I strongly recommend that there's some kind of review, hopefully in the sports hall, on the whiteboard. Okay, so you want some kind of review and bringing it together on the whiteboard and discussing those things. So those are activities that I would strongly recommend. They can, you think about what I've just described there, you could be mostly in the classroom doing kind of classroom work, so there's the classroom, and then you just go into the sports hall, you just go in there for 10 minutes. Okay, if that's possible, that's a nice way to do this, and you can get whatever combination you want. But those would be nice things for you to go about actually getting students to experience these particular planes.